Hi, it's B in the flesh. I've finally been able to get my head around the technology, and so I'm going to have a go at filming some of this video. I've been quiet for a while. That's because I've actually been working on a really fun, very entertaining project, which I'd like to tell you all about at the end of this video. But first to business. I really want to discuss the issue of liability in terms of the pandemic in this next few minutes. I think it's something that's been missed out of the dialogue, and I want to bridge that gap. But before we go any further, I'd just like to go through my caveat that I'm not actually a lawyer. I'm not trained in the law. I do have a working knowledge of common law, and I do a lot of research. Nothing about that has changed even over this winter when I've been very busy. So let's begin by having a look at the definition of liability. Liability is one of the most significant words in the field of law. Liability means legal responsibility for one's acts or omissions. Failure of a person or entity to meet that responsibility leaves him or her or it open to a lawsuit for any resulting damages or a court order to perform, as in a breach of contract or violation of a statute. So liability is all about accountability. It's all about responsibility. And in terms of the pandemic, it's about asking the question, who takes liability for any harm, loss or injury that may result as a result of the things that we have been asked to do in order to alleviate the situation, things like lockdown and PCR tests. And it really doesn't matter where you sit in the argument. The question is still the same. So maybe you believe there is a pandemic. Maybe you believe it's a hoax. Perhaps you think that masks can reduce transmission, or maybe you think they're more likely to cause hypoxia in the short term or a lung disorder in the longer term. Maybe you think that the PCR tests are a good thing, or maybe you think they're not fit for purpose. Maybe you think that lockdown is the only way to deal with this situation, or maybe you're someone who's lost their business and just wants to get back to normal and thinks that lockdown is really upsetting our mental health. Maybe you think that the vaccination is going to help things get back to normal, or maybe you think it's going to interfere with our DNA. It really actually doesn't matter where you sit in this argument. The vital question is who takes liability. So at the end of the day, who is going to take liability? Who is going to accept responsibility and accountability for all that we've gone through over the last almost 12 months and may go through for who knows how much longer? Who's going to take responsibility for masks and tests and immunity passports and vaccinations? Who is going to take responsibility and accountability for the way our lives have changed dramatically, so that it's almost unrecognisable, the life that we have now? Maybe for some of you, you're just carrying on as normal, but for a lot of people have undergone a lot of suffering over the last 12 months, and not just because of COVID, but because of the measures that have been taken. So maybe you think that it's the government. The government should take responsibility. We voted them in. They're making the decisions. Are they liable? Or maybe it's the NHS. Or perhaps it's the MHRA who gave temporary license to the vaccination. Or the WHO, the World Health Organization. Maybe it's them. Or the CDC. Or your surgery. Or the police. Who's going to take liability? Well, actually, the answer might surprise you. Because the bottom line is that if we consent to a requirement from somebody else without doing our due diligence, then liability will fall upon us. And that's why the phrase "I do not consent" or the phrase "no" is really important. Because what we need to do now is to start pushing back towards those people who have been requiring so much of us for so long, and actually start saying no, and actually start saying, well, can you show me your proof of indemnity against harm, loss or injury to me and my family as a result of this requirement? So before we go any further, let's take a little step backwards and ask yourselves, if you went to a car showroom tomorrow to buy a new car, would you buy it without a warranty? Why not? And if you went to that new showroom to buy that car, do you think that the salesman would sell you the car if you didn't have insurance and you didn't have a driving license? Why not? And when you go on holiday, do you take out holiday insurance? And do you have home insurance? Ask yourself, why do I have these things? Why do I pay money for these things? Isn't it so that you can mitigate against any harm, loss or injury that's caused to yourself or to your property or to another person? And by doing these things, by taking these insurance policies out, does that mean you're a conspiracy theorist? Does that mean that you're some kind of nut job? Or is it a perfectly normal thing to do? So my question then is, why is it a perfectly normal thing for us to do, but not necessarily a perfectly normal thing for the powers that be to do? Why is it that the vaccination, the experimental medical intervention, has been passed temporarily by the MHRA and has had its liability waived? Who is responsible for that? Who is going to take responsibility for any harm caused by this so-called wonder drug? Who is going to take responsibility if any harm is caused to you because of the mask wearing, or because of the test, or because of the immunity passport, because your business is closed? And the very, very sad thing about this is that the government have very, very cleverly passed responsibility for all their mandates onto business owners, onto employees, onto other people. And they've done this under the Public Health and Safety Act or regulations of 2020, which were enacted at the same time as the COVID Act. And this puts responsibility for the welfare and safety of other people onto business owners. And this is why when we go into the shops, we have these people now standing at the door wanting to know where our masks are. And they're doing this because they need to know that we're safe. Or they feel they need to know we're safe. But these people are actually shop owners. They're not litigators or lawyers. They're just doing their job. But they've had this added bit pushed upon them because the government has very, very cleverly stepped out of the way and said, oh no, these things, you must make your own mind up. You don't have to show your badge. You don't know. And making it really quite difficult for other people to do their jobs, and not really giving people the training that they need in order to know how to navigate these waters skillfully. So I'm personally all for pushing back. I'm all for sending to the people that are actually requiring something of us, the government and the powers that be. I'm all for sending them a notice of liability. I've already sent mine. I sent it to leading members of the government. I sent it to the Chief Executive and Chief Operating Officer of the NHS, the Chief Executive of the MHRA, the Attorney General, and two of the most leading members of SAGE. Now, my notice of liability, which I will share with you, is possibly a little bit off the wall, but that is what I wanted to write. It's already gone off. And so I'm adding something that is perhaps a little bit more formal that you might want to use, or you might want to use and tweak a little bit. I always say do what resonates. don't necessarily use my words. Stand in your power, not in mine. So I'm urging everybody and encouraging everybody to send a notice of liability, first and foremost, to the people actually requiring things of us, and that's the visible representatives of the powers that be are actually government. So send it there. And then we're going to take a look at step 2. And step 2 really is all about dealing with employers. What are we going to do when our children go back to school and they're required, mandated to wear masks all day, and we don't think that's safe? What are we going to do when we walk into a shop and they demand to see our exemption card? Or they won't let us in if we don't show it, or we are not wearing a mask, or they call the police. What are we going to do if our employer says to us, you have to take the test twice a week or voluntarily resign? You have to have the vaccination. You must have the vaccination. It's mandatory here. And if you don't take it, you'll have to resign. And these are all things that are actually happening to people right now. And so how do we deal with them? Well, first of all, we're going to do what I do. I'll tell you what I do if I walk into a shop and people want to see my exemption certificates. I first of all ask them if they're the manager or the owner of the shop. And then I ask to see their policy. I want to see the policy that the store holds that says customers must wear lanyards or show their exemption cards. And then I ask to see the risk assessment. Because how are we supposed to have informed consent if we're not able to see the risk? So if we're being required to wear a mask or a lanyard, or we're going to be refused service if we don't, where is your risk assessment for this? Let me see that you have done due diligence around the risks of wearing a mask. Let me see that you've done due diligence around the risks of taking the test. And then finally, I'm going to ask for proof of indemnity. I'm going to ask to see their insurance policy that covers me for any harm, loss or injury as a result of their requirement. And this is what I do. I actually do this. I've been doing this for a while. It usually doesn't get much further than asking for the risk assessment, but because of a couple of times when I have been quite seriously challenged, I've written into head offices and actually asked for proof of indemnity. I want to see their insurance policy. I've also been helping people who don't want their children to wear masks by helping them to write notices of liability, and also people who are having difficult times at work. And I'm more than happy to help anybody in this situation. I do run a free advocacy service, and I'm encouraging everybody to push back up through the line, push back up through employers, up to the government, because what will happen, or what I'm hoping will happen, is if we push upwards, they then will push upwards and say, hey, these people want us to be liable. What are we going to do about that? Are you going to take liability? Because what we really want in all of this is for the government to accept responsibility for their actions, to actually accept the liability. It's all very well standing in front of a microphone and talking about the science and saying we strongly recommend this and the figures are that, and we really need you to do this. Absolutely fine, carry on, but put your money where your mouth is and show us your indemnity. So there you have it, a little bit about liability from me, and as you can probably gather, I'm really quite passionate about this. So just to recap, liability means taking responsibility or accountability for our actions and ensuring that we personally are insured in case we cause loss, harm or injury to another person. Where we consent to a requirer, so when someone requires something of us, such as a mandate or a direction, where we consent without doing our due diligence, we inadvertently become liable. So we have to take on the liability. So we need to think carefully about that. And another point of law, which I could mention, is that in any contract, the living man is always the beneficiary. So we need to ask ourselves, if we are the beneficiary of the contract, if we are going to benefit from these mandates, who is standing guarantor? Who is standing surety to make sure that we do benefit from these interventions? And if we don't, who's going to compensate us? So who is that person? Who is that body that stands surety? It's the requirer. That's who it is. So what we need to do is to begin to very firmly give back liability to those who want something of us, to those who require something of us, to those who are making these mandates and imposing them upon us. Give them the liability by sending them a notice of liability, and give back to any shopkeepers or your employers or whoever, give them the liability by asking to see their policy, asking to see their risk assessment, asking to see their insurance policy. And let's see, if we all do this, whether things change. So that's really all I have to say on the subject of liability. And now I'm going to start talking about this exciting new project that I've been involved in. It came about quite by chance as a result of the lockdown, when a friend and I were having a conversation about some of the more ludicrous aspects of the government's requirements. Things like, I mean, you probably have heard some of these, but things like stay at home unless you need to go out, go to work, don't go to work, go to work. Look out for our elderly and vulnerable people, but under no circumstances approach them. And my most favourite of all, your children are now officially weapons of mass destruction. So, having had a good giggle about some of these things that seem to be implied by the government, my friend and I decided we'd quite like to write a play. And as we were discussing it, we decided that this play was more of a board game. And so we actually have sat down over the winter and we've designed a board game. And really this board game is mirroring the lockdown. It's mirroring the situation that we find ourselves in. And it's all about a chase around a COVID spike, trying to avoid mandate mayhem and collect necessary PPE cards along the way, until finally, if you actually collect the whole set, you can make your way to the COVID checkpoint and get along the syringe, where you can earn yourself a pint of freedom at the No More Tears pub. So I'm just going to leave you with a little video of what we've been doing. And just to ask you, if any of the work that I've been doing over the last 6 months has resonated with you, and you feel that you'd like to support us in launching Covidiots, then there is a little tab at the end of the video where you can access our site and go to our launch page and actually make a pledge, because we'd be very, very grateful to offset some of the money that it's going to cost us to launch this game. And that page is known as Kickstarter. So go onto our website, access the Kickstarter page, give us your details, and if you feel that anything about this resonates with you, especially as this is, although it's a fun family game, it's also a little bit educational. for people who are perhaps still asleep, a little bit of a wake-up call for them. So please have a look, see what you think, and from me it's goodbye until next time. So just as I'd finished this video, I learned that the government have now extended their COVID Act powers for another 6 months. So I've included a link to my suite of videos, and I'd particularly draw your attention to the ones entitled Your Get Out of Lockdown Card, in which I explain how to put together a notice of conditional acceptance that you can send to the government, and also the one entitled Empowering Yourself and Educating Others During COVID, which explains the law and the concept of the straw man and admiralty law and common law. It's important to understand that we are being invited as free beings of the land to accept this extension. So where we refuse to consent, once we've sent in our notice of conditional acceptance, we are then free to go about our business. It's also worth noting that the COVID Act of 2020 is only enforceable on the straw man, and it's only enforceable once it's been proved, should it ever be proved, that SARS-CoV-2 has been isolated in an asymptomatic person with no underlying comorbidities, and that it meets Koch's postulates. Without that, anybody trying to enforce the COVID Act could be deemed guilty of aiding and abetting fraud, and this is something that if you are challenged by the police, you might want to think about letting them know. As they caution you, you can also caution them. So I just thought I'd add this as a little postscript so that we can continue to be empowered during this next few months.
Good evening. As you know, the Cabinet and I hold your welfare close to our hearts. With this in mind, our colleagues in FART, the Public Health Activities and Recreation Team, have developed a fun, innovative board game for you to play during these unprecedented times. I am now going to ask my chief advisor, Don Pennick, to talk you through the slides, please.
Thank you, Prime Minister. The aim of the game is to move around the board collecting PPE called cards. These can be collected as you travel around the board by landing on PPE spaces or through directions on other cards. Once a player has collected all 6 PPE core cards, they can proceed to the PPE card checkpoint to gain access to the syringe. Caution: there are mandates and tasks that could hinder your game. Once on the syringe, players must throw an exact roll to move along the syringe to the pub where they can declare themselves the winner.
Thank you to my chief advisor, Colonel Pennick. So we are updating our lockdown guidelines, and I am personally mandating that everybody in the UK must play Covidiots. So remember to stay sane, stay safe, and play Covidiots, because it's the right thing to do.